Captain Adrian Voss stood at the edge of the grand balcony of Velethus Prime, his eyes scanning the alien city sprawling beneath him. The sky was bathed in a violet hue, and the air hummed with the faint energy of the planet's twin moons. Hadrian had been stationed here for weeks, leading the Terran delegation in delicate talks with the Eleutheri, an ancient proud species known for their beauty and their fierce pride. His mission was simple but incredibly high stakes: secure an alliance between the Terran Union and the Eleutheri Empire. But today, things would take an unexpected turn. He straightened his uniform, the light from the planet's moons reflecting off the silver lining of his collar. His posture was strong, yet his mind was sharp and calculating, focused on the negotiations that had been progressing far slower than he liked. The Eleutheri were notorious for their arrogance, and they saw humanity as a lesser race. Though they acknowledged human strength, they still viewed Terrans as novices in the ways of the stars. It was frustrating, but Adrian had always been good at playing the game of diplomacy. He knew how to make them listen, how to command their respect, without bending to their pride. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind him, and Adrian turned to see Princess Silvera approach. The Eleutheri princess was every bit the legend that her people had crafted her to be: tall, radiant, with glowing gold markings etched along her arms and face. Her silver-blue hair cascaded down her back like a shimmering waterfall, and her eyes, those mesmerizing, amber eyes, burned with intensity. But it wasn't just her beauty that commanded attention. It was the power she carried in every step, the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from her. As the heir to the Eleutheri throne, Silvera was used to getting what she wanted, and that included having the respect and admiration of anyone in her presence. "Captain Voss," she said in a voice that was smooth yet held an edge of challenge. Adrian couldn't help but be drawn to her presence, even though he had never been one to bow to royalty, no matter the species. "Silvera," he replied evenly, his tone measured. "I assume you have news from the council." Her gaze sharpened, and there was something almost predatory in her smile. "News, yes, but I also have a personal matter to discuss." Adrian raised an eyebrow. A personal matter? He hadn't been expecting anything like that. "I'm listening," he said, though his mind remained focused on the politics that were about to unfold. Silvera stepped closer, her gaze not leaving his. She reached into the folds of her ornate robes and withdrew a small, beautifully crafted box. With a flick of her wrist, the box opened, revealing the shimmering, intricate engagement ring. The jewel at the center was a deep red, like the heart of a dying star, and its glow seemed to pulse with energy. "I have come to offer you my hand in marriage, Captain Voss," she said boldly, her voice unshaken. "Marry me, and together we will lead our peoples into a new era of prosperity." Adrian's mind raced. This wasn't what he had prepared for. He had been sent here to build a political alliance, not to become the prince consort of an alien empire. His heart skipped a beat, not out of affection, but out of disbelief. "Marriage?" he repeated slowly, his voice laced with confusion. "You're offering me marriage?" Silvera nodded. "Yes, it would be a union that unites our people. You may be human, Captain, but I see strength in you, strength that would benefit my empire." Adrian's brow furrowed as he processed her words. He knew the Eleutheri believed in power, in dominance, and in the necessity of strong alliances. But this proposal, coming so suddenly and without warning, felt like a move in a much larger game, a game he wasn't sure he was ready to play. "I'm afraid I cannot accept," Adrian said firmly, his voice carrying more weight than he expected. Silvera blinked, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "You refuse me?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with an unexpected tension. Adrian stood tall. "I'm not refusing you. I simply don't marry for politics." Silvera's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't step back. Instead, she smirked. "Very well, Captain. But you should know, Rejection like this is unheard of. No one has ever turned down an offer from the Eleutheri. Adrian stared back at her, knowing he had just made a powerful enemy, but also understanding that the game had just changed completely. The room was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Captain Adrian Voss stood with his arms crossed, unwavering as Princess Silvera stared at him, her amber eyes blazing with something between disbelief and irritation. Her golden markings shimmered in the dim light of the chamber, but it was the force in her presence that was most striking. The idea of being rejected by a mere human seemed to irk her deeply, and for a moment, Adrian could almost feel the heat radiating from her. "You refuse me," Silvera repeated, her voice cold but tinged with something dangerous, like a storm just waiting to break. Adrian, however, stood his ground. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to back down now. "Yes," he replied firmly, his tone not mocking but resolute. "I will not marry for political advantage. I came here to form an alliance, not to be part of some power play." For a moment, the princess's face betrayed no emotion, but the subtle twitch of her lips betrayed her frustration. Silvera had never known anyone to reject her proposal. She was the heir to the Eleutheri throne, a race of powerful, graceful warriors, a woman of status and influence. To be turned down by a human was unheard of. No one had ever had the audacity to defy her. "You do not understand the importance of this, Captain," Silvera said, her voice still controlled but edged with an intensity that made Adrian's instincts hum with awareness. "This would not just be a marriage. It would unite our people, end centuries of conflict, and elevate both the Eleutheri and your Terran Union to an unparalleled level of power." Adrian listened closely, but he shook his head slowly. "I understand what you're offering, but that's not why I'm here. I'm not some pawn to be moved on your political chessboard." Silvera's eyes narrowed. "You will regret this decision," she said quietly, but there was a steel in her words. "I am not accustomed to being rejected." The words were a warning, but Adrian didn't flinch. He had dealt with threats before, just not quite like this. He had never had to refuse a royal proposal, let alone one from a species as proud as the Eleutheri. But his instincts told him this wasn't about politics for Silvera. No, this was personal. "I'm sure you're not used to it," Adrian said, "but my answer still stands." A long silence passed between them. Silvera stood, unmoving, staring at him. Her expression shifted, though. There was no anger in her eyes. At least, not the kind he had expected. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity. "You truly believe you can refuse me and walk away with no consequence?" she asked, her voice low but with an edge of challenge. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "I do. I'm not afraid of you, Princess." Silvera's lips curled into a smile, but it was far from friendly. "You are brave, human. I'll give you that. But bravery alone will not save you from the consequences of your choice." Adrian knew exactly what she meant. The Eleutheri were not known for their mercy, and if he had just insulted the royal family, the repercussions could be severe. He was, after all, a human in their domain. But something about Silvera's demeanor intrigued him. Despite her position, despite her beauty and strength, she wasn't threatening him in the way he had expected. She wasn't angry. She was intrigued. "You can threaten me all you want, Princess, but my decision remains the same," Adrian said calmly. "If you wish to continue this alliance, we can find another way. But I'm not going to be part of a royal game I didn't sign up for." Silvera's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. She took a step closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. "You truly are different from anyone I've met," she murmured. "Very well, Captain Voss. If you will not marry me, then we will see who truly holds the power in this alliance." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, Adrian realized that this might not just be about marriage. It was about proving something. To her, to him, and maybe even to the entire galaxy. Silvera wasn't going to back down. Neither was he. Adrian nodded slowly, understanding that this was just the beginning of a much bigger game than he had ever anticipated. The next day, the atmosphere in the grand hall of the Eleutheri Palace was thick with tension. Princess Silvera had issued a challenge, and Captain Adrian Voss had accepted. What started as a diplomatic mission to secure an alliance between the Terran Union and the Eleutheri Empire had quickly spiraled into something far more personal. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about pride, power, and the sheer determination of two people unwilling to back down. Adrian stood at the edge of the arena, watching as the Eleutheri soldiers prepared the space. The air was buzzing with excitement. The Eleutheri loved a good fight, and they had gathered in droves to witness what they believed would be an easy victory for their princess. They didn't understand why she would even bother with a human, let alone challenge him to a fight. But Adrian wasn't just any human. He had fought in countless battles, led troops in wars across the galaxy, and survived situations that would have broken most others. His strength wasn't just physical, it was mental, and that was something Silvera had yet to realize. Adrian adjusted his uniform and flexed his fingers, preparing for what was about to come. He knew this duel wasn't going to be easy. Silvera was a trained warrior, and despite the arrogance of her people, she was skilled in combat. But Adrian wasn't intimidated. If anything, he was more determined than ever to prove that strength wasn't something you could measure just by how fast you could swing a blade. Finally, Silvera entered the arena. She walked with the grace of a predator, her eyes locked on Adrian as she strode past her own people. The crowd murmured in awe. The princess was everything they expected, tall, poised, with glowing golden markings running down her arms and face, a living symbol of Eleutheri power. But there was something more in her eyes today. It wasn't just confidence, it was unpredictable energy, the kind of focus that made her seem even more dangerous than usual. Adrian noticed this shift in her demeanor. She was still proud, still powerful, but now there was something else beneath the surface. Curiosity. She was studying him, sizing him up, as though trying to figure out what exactly made this human so different from the others who had come before him. "I hope you're ready, Captain Voss," Silvera called out, her voice strong, echoing across the arena. Adrian didn't answer at first. Instead, he simply took his stance, the quiet confidence in his posture speaking louder than any words could. The crowd went silent in anticipation. The signal was given, and Silvera charged. She moved faster than Adrian had anticipated, her long legs carrying her with incredible speed. Her blade, a sleek silver weapon with an energy core, flashed in the sunlight as she swung it toward him. Adrian barely had time to react, ducking just in time to avoid the strike. The ground beneath him cracked as the blade slammed into the stone floor. The crowd gasped. They hadn't expected him to dodge. But Adrian wasn't done. As Silvera pulled her sword back for another swing, he seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, using her momentary loss of balance to his advantage. With a quick maneuver, he disarmed her, sending her blade flying out of her hand and skidding across the ground. The crowd gasped again, their shock evident. Silvera, however, didn't flinch. She wasn't done yet. She circled him, her eyes calculating. Adrian could feel the intensity building, the challenge still in her gaze. She wasn't just fighting to win. She was fighting to understand. She had to prove to herself, to her people, that a human could never best her. But Adrian wasn't fighting to win a crown or a title. He was fighting for respect, for himself, for his people, and for the truth that strength could come from anywhere, even from someone like him. Silvera charged again, but this time, Adrian was ready. He sidestepped and, with a quick move, knocked her to the ground, his knee pressing into her chest as he held her wrist firmly to the stone. The crowd fell completely silent. Silvera, stunned but not defeated, locked eyes with him. "Still think I'm not worth your time?" Adrian asked softly, his breath steady despite the intensity of the moment. Silvera, caught in the unexpected turn of events, said nothing. Instead, she simply stared at him, Her pride, her strength, her arrogance all there in her eyes. But there was something else now, something Adrian hadn't expected, a spark of respect. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the human before her, the one who had just defeated her in a way no Alethari had ever imagined. It wasn't the kind of victory anyone had expected, but it was enough to change everything. The tension in the arena was still palpable as Princess Silvera slowly stood up, brushing off the dust from her robes. Her golden markings shimmered under the harsh light, but her eyes were no longer filled with the same fiery confidence. Instead, there was a strange mix of admiration and something else, curiosity. She had never imagined a human, let alone a Terran, could defeat her in combat. Adrian had not just won. He had done so in a way that forced her to rethink everything she had believed about her people's superiority. Captain Adrian Voss stood several paces away, breathing evenly, his posture relaxed but alert. He hadn't expected this to be easy. He had trained for years, not just in battle but in reading people, understanding their motivations. And what he had just learned was something that most Alethari would never admit. Silvera's pride, her need to win, to maintain control, was her greatest strength, but also her greatest weakness. The crowd was silent. It wasn't often they saw their princess defeated, and it had clearly shaken them. But Adrian didn't bask in the victory. He didn't need to. His focus remained sharp, his mission still at the forefront of his mind. He knew that the battle was far from over. The arena might have quieted for now, but there was still much to be done if he was going to secure the alliance. "Get up," Adrian said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "You're not defeated yet." Silvera stared at him, her eyes searching his face as though she was looking for something. She wasn't used to being spoken to like that. Most people, especially men, would have cowered in her presence. But Adrian had shown her something else entirely. He had shown her humility and resolve, the kind of qualities that made him stand out, not just as a fighter, but as a leader. "Why did you do it?" Silvera asked after a long pause. Her voice was quieter now, softer than before, but there was still a sharp edge to it. Adrian tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "Why did I fight you?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "No," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Why did you reject me?" It was a question Adrian had expected. Silvera had been so sure of herself, so convinced that her beauty, her power, would be enough to win him over. But he hadn't cared about her status. He hadn't cared about her lineage. He cared about the alliance, about the future of his people, and most importantly, about doing what was right. "Because I don't want a crown, Silvera," Adrian said, taking a step closer. "I want respect, and I'm not going to earn it by marrying into politics." For the first time, Silvera looked uncertain. Her lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but the words never came. Instead, she seemed to process his words. Adrian had spoken plainly, without any games, and it was the most direct approach anyone had ever taken with her. After a moment, Silvera took a deep breath and looked up at him, her eyes burning with a new intensity. "I never expected you to be so different." She said it with an odd mix of frustration and fascination. Adrian's expression softened, though only slightly. "And I never expected you to be so human." Silvera's lips twitched as if she were trying to suppress a smile, though she quickly hid it. "You think you've won, Captain, but this is far from over." Adrian raised an eyebrow, sensing the challenge in her words. "What do you mean?" "You may have defeated me today, but there is more at stake here than pride," she replied, her voice growing serious again. "If you think I'm going to simply accept your rejection and walk away, you are wrong." Adrian nodded slowly. "I don't expect you to. But I can't marry you, Silvera. Not for politics, not for anything." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the horizon, her expression thoughtful. The princess wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but for the first time, Adrian saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't just questioning his rejection. She was questioning everything she had built her life upon. And that, in its own way, was more powerful than any victory he could claim. Adrian stood tall, knowing this was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. The stakes had just been raised, and neither of them was going to walk away without the other learning something new. The days following the duel were a whirlwind of discussions, tension, and unexpected alliances. Captain Adrian Voss had thought that by rejecting Princess Silvera, he had set a clear boundary. But what he hadn't anticipated was just how much it would shake the Eleutheri Empire. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about the future of both their peoples. And now, Adrian found himself caught in a game that was far more complex than he had ever imagined. Silvera, despite her initial prideful anger, had not given up on her mission. She had retreated to her private chambers after the duel, but Adrian knew she was not the type to sulk. The princess was plotting, calculating, and as he learned in the following days, she was starting to respect him in a way she had never respected anyone before. It was unsettling, in a way. He had come here to negotiate an alliance, to ensure the survival and growth of the Terran Union, but now it felt like he was part of something far bigger, something with much higher stakes. Adrian had spent the next few days in the palace, trying to navigate the delicate political situation. The Eleutheri officials had been careful around him. Knowing that Silvera's challenge had shaken their perception of the Terrans, it was clear that they now viewed him with a mixture of respect and wariness. The tables had turned, but Adrian didn't feel comfortable celebrating. There was too much riding on this mission. He was walking through the palace gardens one evening when Silvera approached him again. She was no longer wearing the regal armor of a warrior, but her presence was no less commanding. Her silver-blue hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes, still filled with that fire, seemed softer somehow, more contemplative. Captain Voss, she greeted him, her tone neutral but with a hint of something else. Adrian turned to face her, surprised to see her out here. "I didn't expect to see you," Adrian said. "Thought you'd be preparing your next move." Silvera smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I have been, but I wanted to speak to you directly." Adrian nodded, motioning for her to continue. The air between them had shifted, but he wasn't sure where things stood yet. "I've been thinking about what you said after our duel," Silvera began, her voice quieter now. "About respect, not marrying for politics. I've spent my entire life believing that power is the key to everything. But what you did, rejecting me, it made me realize I've been wrong." Adrian raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected such an admission. "I didn't mean to make you doubt yourself." Silvera shook her head. "You didn't. It wasn't about you. It was about what I've been taught all my life. That power is everything. But I've never had to fight for respect, Captain. I've never had to earn it. It was always handed to me because of who I am." She paused, her gaze turning inward, as though she were reflecting on something deeper. "But you don't care about my title. You don't care about my name or my lineage. You care about what's right. And that is something I never understood." Adrian didn't speak at first. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy cloak. He hadn't expected Silvera to be so honest, but maybe that was what this mission was all about, breaking through the walls that the Eleutheri had built around themselves for centuries. "I'm not trying to change you, Silvera," Adrian finally said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I'm just trying to make sure our people have a future, one where we can work together, not for political gain, but because it's the right thing to do." Silvera met his gaze, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to see past the surface, trying to understand the man who had defied her in every way possible. For the first time since they had met, Adrian saw something in her eyes that wasn't just pride or calculation. It was vulnerability. "You're not what I expected," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "But that's not necessarily a bad thing." Adrian smiled faintly, knowing that this was the beginning of something far more significant than either of them had anticipated. Silvera had just admitted that she had been wrong, and for someone of her status, that was monumental. But the path ahead would not be easy. There were still factions within the Eleutheri Empire who wouldn't accept this new way of thinking, who wouldn't embrace the idea of working with humans. Adrian and Silvera both knew that. But now, at least they were no longer enemies. They were something more, partners in a cause far bigger than themselves. And that made all the difference. The following weeks passed in a blur of strategy meetings, tense negotiations, and unexpected moments of understanding. Captain Adrian Voss had never imagined that a simple mission for peace would turn into something as complicated as it had. At first, he had only wanted to secure an alliance between the Terran Union and the Eleutheri Empire to ensure the survival of his people in a galaxy full of dangers. But with each passing day, he found himself drawn deeper into the complexities of Eleutheri politics and, surprisingly, into an uneasy partnership with Princess Silvera. Silvera had begun to change. She was still the proud, confident leader of the Eleutheri, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her interactions with Adrian were no longer filled with the tension and challenge that had marked their first encounters. Instead, there was an unexpected sense of respect. The princess had begun to see the Terran captain not as a mere pawn in her game of power, but as a worthy ally. It wasn't just that Adrian had defeated her in combat. It was that he had earned her trust, something no one else had ever done. One evening, Adrian and Silvera found themselves walking through the royal gardens together, discussing the finer points of their alliance. The stars above twinkled in the night sky, and the soft hum of Eleutheri music filled the air, adding an almost ethereal quality to the moment. "I never thought I'd be out here talking to you like this," Silvera remarked, her voice low as she watched a distant group of Eleutheri soldiers practicing their combat skills. Adrian chuckled. "I'm sure you never thought a human would be able to hold his own against you either." Silvera shot him a playful look, though it was clear that her pride had been replaced by something else. Amusement, maybe even admiration. "True, but then you've done far more than just hold your own. You've made me rethink everything I believed about humans." Adrian nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm glad to hear that, but don't think for a second that we're anything like you." Silvera raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? We may be similar in some ways, but humans don't come with the same history. We don't have centuries of tradition and pride to carry with us. We make our own way forward. It's not always pretty, but it works for us." Silvera considered this, her eyes studying him thoughtfully. "You make it sound like your people are always starting from scratch." Adrian shrugged. "Maybe we are, but it means we don't have to carry the weight of the past with us. We're more flexible, and that's what makes us strong." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Silvera said nothing. The princess seemed lost in thought, her expression distant. Adrian couldn't help but wonder what was going on behind those amber eyes. She had always been a leader, a symbol of strength for the Eleutheri, but there was something in her posture now, something less certain, more reflective. Finally, she spoke. "I've always believed that strength comes from the past, from the lessons learned by our ancestors. But maybe you're right." Adrian turned to look at her, surprised by her admission. "You're saying that history doesn't define us?" Silvera nodded slowly. "I think it can, but it doesn't have to. The past shapes us, but we don't have to be bound by it. You've shown me that." Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear those words from Silvera, not after everything that had happened. The pride, the arrogance, the belief that the Eleutheri were above everyone else. It had all seemed so ingrained in her, but here she was, admitting that there was another way. "You've got more potential than you know, Princess," Adrian said, his voice sincere. Silvera met his gaze, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was no challenge now, no hidden agendas. Just two people standing together in the quiet of the night, trying to make sense of the future they were creating. "I didn't expect to find a partner in you, Captain," Silvera said quietly, her words softer than usual. "But perhaps this alliance isn't just about politics after all." Adrian nodded, his expression serious. "Maybe it's about something more. Maybe it's about both of us finding a way forward, together." For the first time, Silvera smiled genuinely, the warmth in her eyes unmistakable. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and opposition, but Adrian knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, in itself, was a victory. As they stood there in the cool night air, the future of the Terran Union and the Elithari Empire felt a little bit brighter. The real challenge was just beginning, but at least now, they had each other. As the days turned into weeks, the alliance between Captain Adrian Voss and Princess Silvera continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Despite the skepticism that still lingered among certain factions of the Elithari Empire, there was no denying the growing bond between the two. The negotiations for peace and trade had become more than just politics. They had become a personal mission, one that neither of them could ignore. Adrian had always been a man of action. He didn't waste time with niceties or diplomacy when there was work to be done. But with Silvera, it was different. He had learned to trust her judgment, and to his surprise, she had come to trust his. Their conversations had become more than just strategic meetings. They would spend hours talking about their cultures, their people, and the future they both wanted to create. For Adrian, it was a chance to understand a world he had never thought much about, and for Silvera, it was an opportunity to see beyond the walls of her royal upbringing. One evening, as they sat on a balcony overlooking the sprawling Elithari city, the quiet hum of the palace blending with the distant sounds of the marketplace below, Silvera broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder, Captain," she asked, her voice soft, "if we're making the right choices?" Adrian looked at her, surprised by the question. He had always thought of Silvera as a leader who was sure of herself, someone who never second-guessed her decisions. But now, in this rare moment of vulnerability, he saw a different side of her, the one that wondered if all their efforts were enough. "I think we're doing the best we can," Adrian replied honestly. "There will always be doubts, always be those who question our actions. But we're moving forward, and that's what counts." Silvera nodded slowly, her amber eyes reflecting the dimming light of the setting sun. "I've never been one to doubt myself," she admitted, almost in a whisper. "But there's something about this alliance with the Terran Union that makes me wonder if we're truly prepared for what comes next." Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the stone railing. "No one can ever be fully prepared for the unknown, but we can face it with strength. And we're not alone in this. We've got each other, Silvera." She met his gaze, her lips curling into a small, thoughtful smile. "You've always had a way with words, Captain. But you're right. We're in this together." The words hung in the air between them, filled with meaning. It wasn't just about political alliances anymore. It was about partnership, about facing the future with someone who understood the stakes as well as you did. Adrian had come to realize that, for all her pride and strength, Silvera wasn't so different from him. Both of them were leaders trying to find a way to balance duty and personal conviction, trying to make the right choices in a world that often seemed unpredictable and unforgiving. As the stars began to twinkle above, Adrian and Silvera sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared responsibility settling over them. They had made it through the first hurdles of their alliance, but the true test was yet to come. The Elithari Senate and many of the Union's officials were still skeptical about this partnership. But despite the challenges, Adrian felt something he hadn't expected, a quiet, growing hope that maybe, just maybe, they could pull it off. "You know," Silvera said after a long pause, breaking the silence, "I've always been taught that weakness is something to be avoided. That showing any vulnerability is a sign of failure." Adrian turned to her, intrigued. "And what do you think now?" Her gaze softened, the usual sharpness in her eyes replaced by something gentler. I think maybe vulnerability isn't weakness at all. Maybe it's where strength begins. Adrian smiled, impressed by her insight. I think you're starting to see things the way I do. She chuckled softly. I'm learning, Captain. Slowly but surely. In that moment, as they both looked out over the Eleutheri city, it was clear that their alliance was more than just a political arrangement. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would take them down a path filled with uncertainty, challenges, and perhaps even some unexpected triumphs. Together, they would face whatever came their way, not as enemies or rivals, but as true partners. And for the first time since they had met, Adrian felt confident that they might just succeed. The days were growing shorter, and tensions were rising. Captain Adrian Voss could feel the weight of the coming storm as he walked through the Eleutheri Palace corridors. The alliance between the Terran Union and the Eleutheri Empire was hanging by a thread, despite all the progress he and Princess Silvera had made. Adrian knew that behind the walls of the palace, powerful factions were still not convinced that this alliance was the right move. Some saw it as a threat to their authority, others as an unnecessary risk. The road ahead wasn't just about diplomacy, it was about survival. And that meant overcoming the doubts that plagued both their people. Adrian paused in front of a large ornate door, hesitating for a moment before entering. Inside, he found Silvera seated at a table covered with data pads, reviewing reports from both the Eleutheri Senate and the Terran Union's political offices. She looked up when he entered, her sharp gaze meeting his with a quiet intensity. Everything all right? Adrian asked, taking a seat across from her. He could sense the unease in the air, the same feeling he had been carrying for days. Silvera leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. I don't know, Captain. We're getting pressure from both sides now. The Senate isn't happy with how fast this alliance is moving. And some of your people are questioning whether we can trust the Eleutheri at all. Adrian nodded, understanding all too well the precariousness of the situation. It wasn't just politics, it was about perceptions, and those could change on a dime. One wrong move, one poorly timed decision, and everything they had worked for could fall apart. I'm aware, he said, his voice steady, but we can't let fear dictate our actions. We've come this far, Silvera. We've shown them that we can work together. She met his eyes, a flicker of doubt passing across her face. But can we really? You've seen the whispers. The rumors. Some of them say that we're moving too fast, that we're too eager to trust each other. Adrian leaned forward, his tone serious. I know there are risks. There will always be risks when two different worlds come together. But we're not just making promises, Silvera. We're proving something to ourselves and to everyone else. If we back down now, if we show weakness, it will all be for nothing. She looked at him thoughtfully, and for a long moment, the room was silent. The princess's golden markings seemed to glow faintly in the low light, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed just a little. You're right, she said at last. But it's not just about us, is it? It's about the future of both our peoples. Adrian nodded, appreciating her understanding. Exactly. We're doing something no one has ever done before. And that's why it's so important that we stay strong. We're setting the foundation for something that will last long after we're gone. That is what will get us through. Silvera took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling on her. I wish I could believe it's that simple, she admitted, her voice quieter now. I've been taught that power is everything, that it's the only thing that can guarantee the survival of my people. But maybe there's more to it. Maybe trust, maybe respect, is the key to something greater. Adrian smiled, relieved to see the shift in her. I think you're starting to understand it, Silvera. Trust isn't a weakness. It's the strongest weapon we have. Just then, the door to the room opened, and an aide entered, holding a data pad. Your Highness, Captain Voss, the Senate has requested a meeting. They're ready to discuss the alliance terms. Adrian and Silvera exchanged a glance. The time had come. This wasn't just a matter of politics anymore. It was a test of everything they had built. "Let's go," Adrian said, standing up. "We're ready." As they walked toward the meeting room, the weight of the moment hung over them. The tension was palpable, but this time, it wasn't fear that drove them forward. It was determination. They had faced down the challenges of the past, and now they would face the future together. Silvera turned to Adrian, her voice steady. "No matter what happens, Captain, I'm glad we did this. Together." Adrian smiled, his heart resolute. "We're not done yet, Princess, but we will get through this. Together." And as they entered the meeting room, the door closing behind them, Adrian felt the first real sense of hope he had since arriving on Elithar. This was just the beginning, and with Silvera by his side, they would find a way forward. The room was silent as Captain Adrian Voss and Princess Silvera stood side by side, facing the powerful figures of the Elithari Senate. The air was thick with tension, each member of the Senate sitting in their high-backed chairs, their gazes sharp and unyielding. Adrian could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. It was now or never. The alliance that had brought the Terran Union and the Elithari Empire to the brink of peace hung in the balance. Silvera, who had always carried herself with the calm assurance of a leader, now looked more like the young woman she truly was, caught between the world she had been taught to protect and the one she was starting to build with Adrian. But despite the uncertainty in the room, she stood tall, her amber eyes fixed ahead, her voice steady as she addressed the Senate. "This is not just about politics," Silvera began, her voice resonating through the chamber. "This is about the future of our people. The Terran Union may not be our allies by blood, but they are by conviction. Together, we can shape a new world, one built on respect, trust, and cooperation." The words echoed in the quiet room, and Adrian could see the hesitation in the eyes of some senators. They were not convinced. Despite everything he and Silvera had done to forge this alliance, there were still those who believed the Elithari could stand alone, that their pride and power should not be shared with another species. But Adrian knew better than to let doubt creep in. He had seen firsthand what was at stake. The Terran Union needed the Elithari, and the Elithari needed the Union. It wasn't just about diplomacy or military strength. It was about survival. They had been on the edge of destruction once before, and neither of their civilizations could afford to risk that again. Adrian stepped forward, his voice firm as he addressed the Senate. "The Terran Union does not seek to dominate or control. We do not want to change your ways or undermine your power. We only seek to stand beside you, to fight alongside you against the threats that none of us can face alone." For a moment, the room was still. The senators exchanged glances, some frowning, others deep in thought. Silvera's gaze flickered toward Adrian, her expression unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. One of the senior senators, a tall figure with silver markings and a stern face, stood up slowly. "And what makes you think we can trust you, Captain Voss? Your people have their own interests. How can we be sure you won't abandon us when it suits you?" The question was pointed, and Adrian felt the sting of it. But he didn't hesitate. "I understand your fear," he said. "It's a fear we've all felt. But I can promise you this. The Terran Union is not like the other empires you faced. We believe in something more, in something better. Our people have learned from the past, and we know that our future depends on working together, not apart." There was a long silence before another voice spoke up, this time from a younger senator with a more hopeful expression. "If you truly believe in this alliance, Captain, what is your offer? What will you give us in exchange for our trust?" Adrian turned to Silvera, who nodded at him, signaling her agreement. He knew the moment had come to offer something more tangible than just promises. "We offer security," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "The Terran Union will provide advanced technology to help protect your people. We will share our knowledge, our resources, and our military strength to defend the Elithari Empire. And in return, We ask for nothing more than a future where we are equals." Silvera added, her voice unwavering, "This is not about power. This is about peace. This is about building something lasting for our children, for our grandchildren. Together, we can forge a future that neither of our peoples could achieve alone." The room remained quiet for a moment as the senators deliberated among themselves. Adrian and Silvera stood together, waiting, the tension between them palpable. Finally, the senior senator who had spoken earlier stood again, his face softening. "Your words carry weight, Captain Voss," he said. "And you, Princess Silvera, have shown a new side to your leadership. Perhaps there is more to this alliance than we realized." The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as the decision seemed to shift in their favor. Adrian and Silvera exchanged a glance, their hearts racing. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, they felt like they had a real chance. And as the Senate cast their vote, Adrian knew that no matter what the outcome, the bond between him and Silvera was stronger than ever. Together, they had done the impossible. Together, they had changed the course of history.